pretty much everybody who was, there was this whole big movement in the late 70s of new guitar companies. And everybody was either hot rodding Gibsons or hot rodding Fenders. I was like more of the Gibson guy. I mean, the designs were kind of easy. I came up with the V-shaped head on the original Deans, which the original one was huge, by the way, because it was based on the body, I think. When I first put it on the market, people, it was like, whoa, I love the guitar, but the head, Because I spent a year trying to build the guitars to get to the NAMM show, to develop the line. So I rented a 3,800 square foot place in Evanston, Illinois. My only formal guitar manufacturing experience was two tours of the Gibson factory. But my first endorsement was, or the first guy I ever played a Dean guitar was Kerry Livgren of Kansas. It was like the 12th or 13th of, by serial number guitar that I had built. So like one of my really early guitars was out on the big stage. I come back, I tell him about my idea. He's like, that's cheesecake, don't do it. We're not doing it. I said, we're doing it. I ran the ad in Guitar Player, and it created more noise in the industry than you would believe. That was a defining moment in my career. Billy Gibbons used to call me on a kind of regular basis just to talk. And I said, let me make a guitar. So I made him a guitar called an ML, that kind of star body shape, and shipped it to him. Sends me a letter. Hey, really nice, can't wait to give it a few whacks. Nothing's ever said about the guitar again. All of a sudden one day I get a call. Man, I'm in the studio doing this record. I've been using your guitar, like every track, you gotta hear this. Go to Houston. He picks me up in his car, puts in the Eliminator record, and plays me the whole thing. Man, that's your guitar and all that stuff. So that was kind of cool. All of a sudden, guitars started moving off the walls. And what happened is I became a household name.
It's July 30th, 1982, and the mighty Van Halen are in Louisville, Kentucky supporting their Diver Down album. After the show, Eddie Van Halen has a phone interview with Jazz Albrecht from Guitar Player magazine. The link to the full interview is down below in the description. Near the end of the call, Eddie starts playing demos he's been putting together. That's when we hear this.
Here we go, here's the synthesizer thing. Can you hear it at all?
Yeah, I hear it good.
Huh?
I can hear it well.
Huh?
I hear it good.
Oh, okay.
Eddie would later recall to Guitar World. I wrote Jump on a sequential circuits Prophet 10 in my bedroom while the studio was being built. Every time I got the sound I wanted on the right-hand split section of the keyboard, it would start smoking and pop a fuse. I got another one and the same thing happened. A guy I knew said I should try an Oberheim OBXA, so I bought one of those and got the sound I wanted. When Jump was released as a single in December of 1983, followed by the iconic music video in January 1984, the reaction was immediate. With the song's powerful melody played on an Oberheim synthesizer and the absence of Eddie's electric guitar for nearly a minute of the 4-minute song, it was a risky move, but ultimately one that paid off. Jump would become Van Halen's most successful single. The ensuing tour would feature Eddie playing keyboards on not only Jump, but on the title track 1984, All Wait, and he would even take a keyboard solo during the show. Granted, there was still plenty of Eddie Van Halen's incredible guitar work on the 1984 album, but the shift in direction wasn't going unnoticed. Kirk Johnson, in an article for the New York Times in April of 1984, would write, "Music industry officials say the increasing importance of keyboard melodic lines in pop music have contributed to the surge in demand, and visual associations with the music through rock video have furthered that trend."
Bands at the time started to incorporate keyboards into their stuff. Why? Well, because keyboards became affordable, and they also became good. I'm a keyboard player as well, so and we had our band in Chicago had no drummer. We were using drum machines and keyboards and guitars and live bass, and it was an interesting, very interesting way to go.
The guitar enjoyed a very, very long run, said Robert Larson, national sales manager for the electronic musical instrument division of Casio. But this is something new. Mobility has made these keyboards an entirely new product.
It was inevitable that something was going to carve away at rock and roll's base because it needed it.
In 1984, a 27-year-old Dean Zielinski had spent the last 8 years building up the Dean Guitars brand. And while the company had become successful, the increased sales of inexpensive keyboards and imported guitars had not gone unnoticed to the Chicago manufacturer. Tastes were changing, and to stay competitive, Dean Guitars would need to change along with it. As reported by Michael Shore of Hit Parader, due to their popularity, Dean Guitars have been selling well and are now being manufactured at such high volumes that all of them, including the Cadillac, which is one of Def Leppard's favorite axes, carry list price tags that are between $150 and $300 less than what they cost a couple of years ago. In addition to lowering the prices on their U.S.-produced models, Dean Guitars would debut the Hollywood and the Hollywood Z models for both guitar and bass, a new line of guitars that would debut at the 1984 Summer NAMM show in Chicago. These were Korean-made, bolt-on models with 24 frets, 2 humbuckers, and the optional new AccuTune locking tremolo system. Available in either solid or custom finishes, and debuting at the affordable list price of $349 and $449 with the AccuTune tremolo installed. While the Hollywood line of guitars would be a hit with dealers due to the competitive price point and custom colors, it would be their introduction at the Summer NAMM show that would end up causing the biggest commotion.
So one year, I'm kind of out of ideas for a NAMM show, and I got the show coming up. We had a guitar called the Hollywood coming out. It didn't make sense, but I said, Hollywood fashion show. Let's get some girls and get a runway and have them strut down and have a, the announcer, hey, here comes, so-and-so with sporting the new blah, 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 this features. Instead of talking about the outfit, you're talking about the guitar. Show up at the NAMM show with we had a runway, had guitars lining the runway, and we had this little clock. We're going to run the show every hour on the hour.
He had a clock and it said next show, and he would move it up slowly. And all of a sudden, Joe and I, we were hoarse, from introducing the different models and stuff. And then we'd talk to the dealers.
Have Easy Top's Legs playing, which is the fur guitar video. And we took pride in the fact that whatever we came up with for a theme for that year's NAMM show was going to be banned by the next show.
We do the first show, and I don't know how many people were there, the clock, but the next, we do the second hour, and you can't get near the booth. There's 400 people, in my booth.
All of a sudden, we'd see this big crowd starting to come because Dean had moved the clock up because he didn't want to lose the people in the booth. And people were standing on PV amps to see the girls.
And then one of the girls came out in a thong. Or a couple of the girls said, let's get rid, and they came out in a thong. All of a sudden, NAMM wants to talk to me. In the middle of the show, they're like, I'm being escorted to the NAMM booth. We're shutting you down.
The first time we started doing NAMM with the Playmate girls and stuff, because Playboy was there in Chicago, God, it was so negative. We got warned for the volume.
Well, the bylaws or whatever, you can't block the aisles. I said, I'm in my booth, I'm okay. Well, you're creating a commotion. I said, I can't help it if my product's popular, but I'm not breaking any rules.
And I'd get caught. I love Dean, but he was always, I was the guy, and I would have to go and apologize.
And they let it go on. They couldn't argue with me, you know what I mean? It was kind of tough because you'd have to wait till the crowd dissipated to be able to take an order. And then like 15 minutes before the next show, everybody's lining up to get a good seat, you know. And this went on for, a couple of days at the NAMM show.
You know, they would either come back or I would target them. Dean had one rule about every show that we did. And he would always come up to me and say, "Sell the booth." Taking it back at that time with the freight, it was a killer. Those were the killer costs involved. You know, when I'm sitting there writing things down on a piece of paper, going, you know, we sell the booth, you know.
And Dean would have girls that said, "Follow me to the Dean booth." And then we got a warning on that one that they walked the floor. They weren't always playmates. We would audition them. We'd sit hotel and they'd come in and we'd look at them and they all had the big, you know, metal hair and stuff.
The sales of guitars are driven by the consumer. So the young guys that are out there, what's on a young guy's mind? Well, you know, girls are on a young guy's mind. And if he's a guitar player and he's looking at these ads, you know, he's in his mind, if he plays this wonderful, you know, guitar, if he plays a Dean Z or a V, he's gonna, you know, he might get that girl.
You did say what reaction that they had. It was a negative reaction a lot because we met with Ray Shearer at Guitar Center, and Ray's like, "We're not buying your stuff. We're not buying. We love the Dean, but we're not going to buy it because we think the girls it's insulting to women and stuff." There was a backlash, but they couldn't stop us from doing it. But not only it put Dean on the map, but we, you know, it gave us marketing dollars. It gave us, it gave us everything really at that point.
While not getting into Guitar Center wasn't ideal, it's important to remember that in 1984, Guitar Center was a chain of only 9 stores, not the retail giant with over 300 locations that they are today. In the mid-'80s, the smaller independent music stores were still a significant force within the industry.
Dealers dealt with people who were in rock and roll music all day long. And their whole deal was, you know, we need something that stands out. And so, we gave it to them.
The guitar business being a fashion business, I always considered it to be a fashion business because every year that you went to a trade show, you had the same variations on a theme. But what they did was they changed up the colors.
You know, you were looking for the colors, you were looking for style, you were looking, it's kind of like the car industry. Style and design is what, drove sales.
You're always looking for something different to give your customers. And knowing that these guitar players were probably open to buying a second or third or fourth guitar, it would be great to give them something totally different than what they had.
And let's remember that it wasn't like we were trying to sell crap. We were trying to sell a good product at a reasonable price.
As mentioned earlier, the Hollywood Series would be the first line of Dean guitars to be produced in Korea. With the quality and demand for Japanese guitars rising, Korea would soon become the next mecca for high-volume, lower-priced guitars. Beginning in 1984, Dean began having guitars produced at the Court Musical Instrument Factory in South Korea. At the time, there was no duty tax in South Korea, and labor costs were 30% less than what they were in Japan, not to mention 80% less than the labor costs in the United States. This would help Dean guitars stay competitive in what was quickly becoming a race to a lower and lower price point. Quote, "I went to the Court factory and taught them how to build guitars so I'd have a steady supply of well-made instruments."
There was a guy named Jack Westheimer, and that was Court. Jack he was in the garment district. He sold baseball mitts. And when the garment district in New York stopped imports from Korea on product, they were trying to stop all these imports coming in. They put a duty on it. And Jack looked, and the only thing that didn't have duty was guitars. That's how Jack did. It's unbelievable,
We were doing, in the search for some instruments to fill some needs below what we were getting from Japan. We had started with a company that was owned by Young Park's father. About 3 years later, because of a tax change, the company was dissolved or partially taken over by the government. His son, who had been my interpreter, friend, and confidant over the 2 preceding years, decided that he wanted to go into business, and that was the start of a company which later became Court, but at first we called it UR, YOO-AH. And then when we got the quality to where we thought it was world class, we changed the name to Court.
But he was well loved. So Samak and Court were the big ones in Korea, and that could do those affordable guitars and do the quality. And Jack was the greatest for Dean and I that you could imagine. I mean, he would advance credit. He would do it for other companies too, but he really loved Dean. He did all the fenders, on the top floor of his Court factory. Jack really saw something in Dean too, and that didn't take us away from other things. But here's what Dean did for Jack. Well, the samples that Dean was getting at the shrimp work, they didn't cut the frets like the right way. They would just clip them in your hands. Dean goes, this is not it. So Dean went to Korea, and then Jack became really our mentor and really helped us. I mean, without Jack, it wouldn't have happened. And I think we had to be competitive. We had to be able to make those guitars. And Korea was not respected. Japan was.
But it was a great thing to do. It got our headstock and our logo out with a lot more people.
Unfortunately, the advantage of producing guitars in Korea would attract more than just Dean Guitars to the Court Musical Instruments factory. Quote, within 6 months, we were followed by every major guitar brand, including Fender, whose large manufacturing demands put a serious squeeze on our supply. To Zielinski, this was history repeating itself, as Fender had also followed Dean Guitars to Japan earlier in the decade. Quote, Mr. Zielinski recalls how sales of the $799 list price Bel Air plummeted after Fender came out with a comparable Japanese-made model for under $400.
The thing about manufacturing, any product, as soon as your competitor goes offshore, you're screwed. You can't not go offshore. And I fought it for a long time because I wanted made in America. I wanted to build guitars.
For more details about this time, I recommend watching Dean Zielinski show number 11 on Dean's own YouTube channel, an episode where Dean discusses the economics of the 80s and training employees at the Korean Court factory. Although Dean Guitars had shown that attractive women could sell guitars just as well as rock stars, from 1984 to the end of the decade, the rock and heavy metal scene would be dominated by offerings from Ibanez, Kramer, BC Rich, ESP, and Charvel Jackson, brands that would go to great lengths and spare no expense to make sure their guitars ended up in the hands of high-profile players, musicians who would be captured inside the pages of countless rock and guitar magazines. When we take a look back at the artist roster from the 1981 Dean catalog, most of these artists had moved on from Dean Guitars by 1984, with the exception of Kerry Livgren. However, by that time, the 35-year-old Livgren had left Kansas and had started a new project, AD, and was playing far smaller venues than his former colleagues from Topeka.
We do have a new album. I'm not going to talk about it a lot because then it starts to sound like a commercial.
All of this isn't to say that Dean Guitars had stopped pursuing artist endorsements. In fact, Dean Guitars would make a big push into the Great White North starting in the early 80s.
I was one of the owners. There were two of us in a retail music store in Mississauga, Ontario. And my partner and I, his name was Terry Jensen. And the two of us had a music store which started September 1974. It wasn't long before we had all the major lines. And it wasn't long before we really had a huge clientele and the business was growing in leaps and bounds. I was always on top of the brochures that were coming out or available, and you could send for them through the Guitar Player magazine. And of course, one day I opened a Guitar Player magazine that would have been in probably, I'm going to say 1978-ish, 79-ish. And there was an ad for Dean. And I received his first brochure. And I remember thumbing through it, and he really had the real nice visual colors. So they were nice deep colors in his color brochure. And the first thing I thought of was, man, our Canadian clientele would just shit themselves. If I got these guitars in, they were so visually impressive that they couldn't resist them. And I remember getting in touch with Dean. And I think before I actually ordered the first ones, I took a flight to Chicago to meet him in person. And that was the first time that I met him. And we just got along great. I mean, Dean is just an easy, laid back guy. He's easy to get along with, easy to like. 7 weeks later, we received our shipment of a half a dozen Deans, and they were gone. They were gone in no time. And so the friends of the guys who had purchased them came back in, they put their orders in, and it started to grow. And then when we met him at the trade show, I think the following trade show would have been, again, late 70s. Dean said, can you help me? Can you get more Deans into Canada? And that's where I sort of took my retailer hat off and then put a new hat on that I'd never put on before, which was, yeah, okay, I'll be your agent or distributor up here in Canada. So I ended up getting samples, putting them in the car, because the guitars were visually stunning. Everything at that point, everybody was used to Fender Strats, Fender Tellys, Les Pauls, SGs, right? Everybody knew what a V looked like. Everybody knew what a Z looked like. But Dean just had a little bit of a different slant on it. So then at that point, he said, can you go out there and try to get some artists? And that was a whole new thing for me. Dean, obviously recognizing that Paul Dean, the guitar player for Loverboy, had the similar last name, he was really interested in going after him. And I did make a few calls, but he wasn't open to it. So he had other people chasing him at the time. And, they were hot for about maybe 2 years, a year and a half. So, yeah, when a band is the flavor of the month, everybody wants them, right? So we found Sharon Alton from the band Toronto. So she came to the shop, to our store, had a look at the various guitar models, and the Cadillac made more sense for her. And the first ad that we ran was a black and white ad. And we had a really popular, really great photographer up here in Canada did the photo shoot. And it was done really tastefully. She was shown with the guitar. The guitar was front and center. And, there she was. Yes, she's gorgeous. There's this gorgeous girl playing guitar. But I think what we tried to project there, or what Sharon wanted to project there, was to send that message to other girls. Rick lived in Mississauga. Triumph actually had their headquarters kind of in Mississauga because of their recording studios. And so I was able to kind of get an in with them and placed a call and totally open to doing it. Rick is just a regular guy. He came down to the store, met with the staff, played a few of the guitars, and then as the conversation started, he was totally open to playing Dean guitars. I don't think it was like a written contract if he was going to be, one of our endorsees, but he had no issues with it either. But the one thing that he wanted was, if he was going to play one, he didn't want the standard neck. He wanted a wider neck, the profile thin front to back. He wanted it to have an ebony fingerboard. He knew what he wanted. He wanted a guitar, and if he was going to have a V, it was only going to have one pickup, one volume control, because everything else was going to be handled from the main board when they were in concert. But the main issue for him was the neck, and he was used to playing the Ackermans that he had, a more classical style, because that was his training, right? And so the only way to get that done was to fly him to Chicago. And that's what happened. So he was open to that. We flew to Chicago. We spent a day. I think Rick probably spent a few hours with the guys in the back. All his guys shaped the neck, and that's what we put on that V. So it was a V with almost a classical wide neck on it. Dean built this guitar. It came back, and I think it was, came in time for the Allied Forces tour. And he used it for various videos and things like that. And I ended up traveling with Triumph to, I think it was 6 or 7 shows across Canada where there were mini Dean giveaways. So there were Dean giveaways at major, radio stations to promote the tour. So Dean would make these cheaper version, Rick Emmett model Deans, and we would give them away. That's it. That's the exact guitar. That was the day that it arrived. So when it came in, of course, the next thing was to take it to Rick. So I took it to his home in Mississauga. And that was a big deal that day. That was a lot of fun,
Quote, "It was surprisingly bright sounding and originally only had one pickup. I had it souped up later and added the Kaler." Live and learn, right? Dean Guitars would also find itself in another award-winning music video in 1984. During the same award show in which ZZ Top would win Best Group Video for Legs, the Cars would win Music Video of the Year for their song You Might Think, which shows bassist Benjamin Orr with a black Dean ML bass, a bass that Ben had been using on and off live for performances since 1979. Speaking of ZZ Top, Zielinski recalls that Billy Gibbons would travel with the Dean Guitars catalog during this time and would use it to help reel in new guitar players for Dean, such as a young Steve Clark and Phil Collen. The results of which can be seen in the Def Leppard video for Me and My Wine, a song that originally came out on their 1981 High and Dry album, but was re-released in 1984 with a music video that was put into rotation on MTV. Notice Joe Elliott and Rick Savage representing Hamer, while Steve Clark and Phil Collen play custom Dean Cadillac and Z models. A fun video in general, with Rick Allen playing a super tiny bass drum and Steve Clark taking a tumble around the 2-minute mark. While it provides great visibility for Dean guitars, and Hamer guitars for that matter, this is the only footage I could find of Steve and Phil playing those Dean guitars, as Steve would stick with Gibsons and Phil would move on to Ibanez before landing with Jackson. Since we're talking about music videos featuring Dean guitars, I would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge a Dean Baby Deluxe ML and Sammy Hagar's I Can't Drive 55 video, easily his most popular song as a solo artist. The song was the lead single and first track from Sammy Hagar's VOA, or Voices of America album.
The guitar, it was a Dean guitar that I used to play on in 83 and 84 when I had my big hit I Can't Drive 55. I did a whole I Can't Drive 55 VOA album with this one guitar. It was on the cover of the album of VOA, parachuting in the White House with my guitar. And I traded that to Ray Boom Boom Mancini for the shorts and the robe that he won the lightweight championship in. But that guitar was really special. And I'm sure he has it, and I've got his robe, but I'd like to have that guitar back.
While this gave Dean guitars some great visibility, Sammy Hagar has been known to play a variety of guitars over the years, from Jackson, B.C. Rich, Gibson, and even an endorsement with Washburn during the late 90s. In fact, on the VOA tour, Sammy would not only play the Dean Baby Deluxe ML, but also a Hamer Scarab, the same Hamer Scarab that would be featured on the cover of Hagar's next solo album, 1987's I Never Said Goodbye.
Yeah, that was the time when artist relations with the manufacturers included cash. Not I want you to play my guitars and I'll make you whatever you want and I'll custom make it for you and I'll do all this stuff. And here's 10 grand. What would we do in that case? Our guitars are better. You like them more. Take the 10 grand, right? I mean, that's what was happening, and we were, we knew where we were. We knew who we were. We knew we weren't going to be able to compete with something like that.
Getting back to 1984, after going to see Van Halen the night before at the Rosemont Horizon, Dean Guitars sales manager Joe DeLeonardis brings up an idea that would take the company into a whole new world of sales potential.
Joe said, "Oh, I saw Van Halen and Michael Anthony, the bass player, had a Jack Daniels bottle."
And Dell says, "Oh, that's cool. We should do something like that." And I said, "Yeah, Jack Daniels." I said, "What?" I said, well, and it just like popped at me that Budweiser.
And I said, wow, that's an interesting thing. For who? And he said, we should just do Bud. And I said, why Bud? And he goes, well, we'll get free beer. And I like Bud. And I'm like, that's how silly this conversation went.
Dean's like, why Budweiser? I said, why Budweiser? I said, because they sell 8 times more beer than Miller. He goes, really? Yeah. I said, they're number 1 in the world. They crush the competition, Dean. Do you know how? I said, by marketing. Marketing.
I said, why don't we do this? We do these Bud things. Dean goes, I really like that idea, but I'm not going to do a can of Bud. Let's do their logo.
If you looked at the Hollywood Z, the Dean Hollywood Z guitar, you could put the Budweiser bow tie. You can make adjustments to that guitar to make it the Budweiser bow tie.
So we had a contact. I called Bud and I said, we want to license something. I knew about licensing, products and stuff. So literally the night before, Dean came to my house and he put the pinstriping. I mean, it was really done, the low lettering. He had his guys cut it and whip it together. And he had this Bud's for you on the headstock. It was pretty cool. Not even fast forward, the next day we go to Bud. And we're at Anheuser-Busch, St. Louis, and the guy is licensing guy, young guy. He's like, oh man, we never, this is kind of cool because we're kind of thinking of getting into rock and roll. And all of a sudden, this guy comes in with a Polaroid and he takes a picture and runs out. Doesn't even say anything. And the licensing guy goes, okay, you're not in licensing anymore. He goes, that's the top floor. We get brought up there. A guy named John Lodge. He's got his back to us, and he's looking out the window. And this is Augie's floor. We're not meeting Augie, but that's the brain trust. We come in and he goes, okay, boys, open up the case. That's what we want to see, what's causing a commotion with everybody. We open up the case. No reaction. He looks at it and he goes, okay, boys, I want 1,000 of those tomorrow.
Quote, my first reaction was, how come this wasn't done before? It seemed like such an obvious thing.
And we start laughing. And Dean goes, this is brilliant. Dean goes, we're not in here to sell you guitars. And I look at Dean and he goes, what do you mean? Why'd you bring a guitar? And Dean goes, tell him, Del. So we had talked about if we had we didn't even know. We want to be your agency. Right, you're my agency, right? And that was it.
And they told them 10 cents of every dollar that comes into Budweiser goes out as marketing. 10 cents of every dollar. The guy said the only company that ever did that in anything that they have ever found out was Sears.
Quote, I made thousands of Budweiser guitars, sold them to Budweiser Corporate and the 1,000 Bud distributors. I'd get a call. Dean, send 102 guitars to a radio station in New York because their call letters were 102.
And so we had to go to Jack Westheimer. And then Jack was like, okay, I'll manufacture these for you. And we were in the Budweiser catalog. And so we started working with their commercials. We did lapel pins. And we ended up with doing the Rolling Stones Steel Wheels tour. And I have those. I still have those instruments. I think Dean does too.
Del was really, really a sharp tie-in guy. I can't tell you how many bars I walk into today and see a Budweiser guitar hanging over the bar. You know what I mean? I want to go up to the bartender and say, see that guitar there? That was my idea.
The return of it was exclusivity on anything that was image of guitars. Even if it was Spud McKenzie, it was going to be the image of the Dean, and they did T-shirts with the Bud guitar and stuff. It was strictly the sales, that their commitment to us, and I don't even know if it was in writing, Chris. I mean, I think it was a handshake with John Lodge from that first day, but we supplied it. We did it. We nailed it every time we could. But Jack was importing those guitars. When Joe and I worked in the downtown warehouse, we had a warehouse for distribution, and we were sitting on the boxes when we first opened up, on the boxes of the Bud guitars as they came in.
In addition to the Budweiser bow tie guitar, Dean Guitars would also have custom-shaped guitars produced for the Anheuser-Busch's Busch Beer. These mountain-shaped guitars would be heavily featured in commercials and marketing materials during this time.
I can't remember the company, but it was a big agency, and it was a young guy, and they said, "Hey, we want you to meet this young guy. He's going to be our producer of our videos, but we want it to be cool stuff with guitars." So we went in, and his account was Busch Beer, okay, and they bought the rights to Like the Breeze. They call me the Breeze. And so I went in and met with this guy, and he was a young guy. He was really cool, long hair, and we're talking. And he goes, "Yeah, I got this great concept. Can you do a guitar?" So we did this Busch guitar with the mountains, the logo, and that video was awesome. And so we ended up doing Busch inflatables and also Budweiser, Bud Light. We did some Bud McKenzie stuff, which talk about kind of inappropriate for the times we're in today, but you know.
Dean Guitars would even go on to produce guitars for Golden, Colorado's Adolph Coors Company, with Strat-style guitars advertising both Coors and Coors Light beer.
But I remember Dean and I going to Golden, Colorado. Thought it was really great because we were sitting in an executive meeting and look out the window and there's people hang gliding. You know, it was a different lifestyle for a couple Chicago boys, but we ended up started to do the Coors thing because if we didn't do it, somebody else would have done it. Fender would have done it.
Dean Guitars would go on to spend the rest of the decade producing various logo and custom-shaped guitars for various companies and events.
One of my backup guitars is a custom-made Dean Mach 5, and it's made out of basswood, and I like light woods on guitars. Basswood and alder are the two lightest woods you can get.
And we had Michael Beatty, who was local to us, and so he was a dear friend, but he played ambidextrous. We'd have him at NAMM show, and people's jaw would drop, you know.
But he was a very, very talented guitar player. And having him around for us was always a good thing. He was one of us, you know. He was one of our guys, you know.
So Michael, I knew from local clubs. Seeing him, and Dean and I both really amazed at him. And he was a great guy. He was a perfect envoy for Dean Guitars to do clinics, to go, because kids wanted to see this amazing presentation. And we featured him at NAMM in the booth the last couple of years I was there. He could have played a lot of companies at that time, but being a Chicago guy, he was kind of loyal. And so he and I traveled together. I remember going to Green Bay, Wisconsin, and we drove up there, and he was sitting low in my car. He was afraid to be seen, you know, because of long hair. He had a great turnout. We probably had maybe 60, 80, could have even been more kids, because he could do his own stuff and videos, and he was self-contained.
And it's got a Kaler tremolo system, 2 humbuckers, and it's got 24 frets. And this is... As you can see, this guitar is pretty beat up, and it's pretty beat up because of doing things on stage like this.
Dean Guitars, often featured in these pages with their hot new models, have reborn themselves and are now the new Dean International Guitar Company. To kick things off with style, they've introduced the new Mach 5 guitar and bass, both with the same sharp, futuristic lightning bolt shape. The guitar features 2 specifically designed humbucking pickups, rock-hard maple neck with 24-fret ebony fingerboard, and a locking, fine-tunable tremolo bridge standard. The bass has a 22-fret rosewood fingerboard and 1 J and 1 P pickup. Both are available in 4 custom finishes: pearl red, pearl white, pearl blueburst, and jet black, and list for the amazing bargain price of only $4.99. Dean would also make the Mach 7, a limited run of U.S.-made guitars, but with a mahogany neck and body, block inlays, and Kaler locking tremolo included at a list price of $14.99. Quote, "We built 5 Mach 7s in the USA. I kept one in a tiger stripe finish. I just recently bought back one of the others in pearlescent white.
This is the only vintage Dean guitar I've ever purchased. Unfortunately, the Mach 7 would end up being the last new model produced in the Chicago factory, as Dean Guitars would end U.S. production sometime in 1986. Dean would later recall, the priority changed from getting great products to getting a deal. It was definitely a race to the bottom. Around the same time, Eddie Van Halen made every guitarist want to play a Strat with a Floyd Rose tremolo. So everyone wanted Fender-style low-end, and we were making Gibson-style high-end, which left us pretty far out of position.
Dean's quality manufacturing stuff was some of the best I've ever seen. And I've been a guy that's been playing guitar since I've been 5 years old. His commitment to making a quality guitar was as high as anyone's that I've ever seen. His business acumen to say, I need to import guitars now or I'm going to go out of business, was just as good. And he was able to do that without falling into the hole first, where you make your company vulnerable to anybody that comes along with a check, you know what I mean, to buy you up. So, Dean knows what he's doing.
Before the end of U.S. production, however, Dean Guitars would see another huge moment in the spotlight, this time from a band going through its own transformation. On June 21st of 1985, the band Heart would release their 8th studio album. The self-titled release would spawn 5 hit singles, and the album would become the band's greatest commercial success to date. While Howard Lacey was an early endorser of Dean Guitars, it would be Nancy Wilson who would be seen playing Dean Guitars during this time. First in the music video for Never, released in August of 1985, and most visibly on the video for the follow-up single, These Dreams, which also features Nancy on lead vocals and playing her Blueburst Baby Deluxe C. The video would debut on MTV in January of 1986, and the song would become Heart's first #1 single on the Billboard charts. As a related side note, What About Love, the first hit single released from the self-titled Heart album, was co-written by Dean Guitars artist Sharon Alton along with her Toronto bandmate Brian Allen and producer Jim Valance, best known for his work with Bryan Adams. In 1985, Dean Guitars would attend the Summer NAMM show in New Orleans. Like the previous Summer NAMM, Dean Guitars had planned another fashion show which would require hiring models to walk the runway and showcase the new guitars. One of these models, Susie Schott, would not only appear at the 1985 NAMM show, but would later go on to marry Dean Zielinski.
It's probably not a secret, but my wife's a Playboy centerfold. She had an agent who I used to hire a lot of models, for advertising and all that stuff. And her agent was a friend of mine. And she was always trying to fix us up. And, timing wasn't always right. Once again, I'm out to lunch with the agent. And it's like a few weeks before a NAMM show. She says, you should really, go out with Susie.
We knew she kind of had a thing for Dean, just telling, she was, not hitting on him or anything, but we could tell there was some spark, Joe and I.
I said, something? I'm doing a NAMM show. It's down in Atlanta. I'm sorry, it was down in New Orleans that year. The one year they had it in New Orleans. I said, I'm doing a NAMM show. I don't really have, big promotion, big thing going on this year. Maybe, do a thing, meet a Playboy Playmate, which was kind of apropos because of the Dean Girl thing.
So we wanted to have her appear. She was a Playmate of the Month. That was the sizzle, even if there was a Dean Girls. But of course, with Susie, it was a much larger step up, if they could get the picture with Susie, if they could, and then you have bragging rights when I don't think the Guitar Center Brain Trust cared, but certainly you're the backbone of the industry, even at Fender with Bill Schultz, was the independent dealer.
So I hired her. I said, let's have her fly down. So she did. I remember picking her up the night before, it must have been Thursday, and we kind of hit it off, and have been it's 28 years later. But literally, I hired her to work a NAMM show, and worked out.
She was a gamer, she went along with anything that we wanted to do, and we would do a show with Tyler Bates and George Andrea, and they were in this band that they played, and Susie would bring the playmates, but Susie just was fun. She just thought it was a cool thing for her, and I think that helped Dean too. But yeah, having a model, and it was consistent. She became, there were the Dean girls, but she was the Dean girl.
That New Orleans show was the worst show in the history of NAMM. I don't know if you want to broadcast this, but it was the slowest show ever.
We had the most fun NAMM show in New Orleans. It wasn't a great show at all.
And it was humid and hot and miserable, but it was New Orleans, and it was really cool.
Dean, he furniture builder, in his mind, he could do these things. He got a fake brick wall, and we had everybody spray paint on the wall like it was graffiti, and the guitars hung from chains. We made every magazine. Dean was the celebrity.
There wasn't much show going on, so it ended up just being a lot more party and not a lot of show, and we had a good time. And
then it was after NAMM that this Dean decided to get married. He proposed, and I went back. I was flying back with him. We stopped in Vegas.
Dean said, I'm going to marry her. We were in California. And he says, we got to stop in Vegas because that's where we're going to get married. We get into Vegas, it's like 3 o'clock in the morning. And we get to these hotels, and they're all sold out. And we're dragging luggage from hotel to hotel. We're literally on the street walking at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we go into one, I think it was the last one that we went into, I think it was Sears. And Dean goes up to the desk and says, I'd like a couple of rooms. And the person says, no, I'm sorry, there are no rooms. He said, let me ask you a question. If President Reagan walked in the door right now and came up to here, would you have a room for him? And she goes, yeah, of course. He says, well, he's not coming. I'll take his room. And she gave us 2 rooms.
Now, it should be noted that Dean Guitars wouldn't be the only guitar company going through significant changes during the mid-'80s. In 1985, a group of Fender employees, led by then-President William Schultz, would purchase Fender from CBS.
CBS decided to get out of the entire music business. And there was talk of just dissolving the company. And finally, the treasurer came to me one day and says, Bill, why don't you put a group together and buy Fender? They were very cooperative. They did everything they could do to help me buy the company. At the very last moment, they lent me $2.5 million, I believe. They recommended me to the bankers that we talked to the investment bankers, and we just put the deal together.
As reported by Guitar Player at the time, as we go to press, Schultz's group is looking for a smaller plant, also in Southern California, one that will allow considerable reductions in overhead. Current plans call for trimming the U.S. workforce from about 275 to between 105 and 110 employees, and domestic production is scheduled to resume in early June.
Bill Schultz had, such a brilliant man who sold guitars out of the trunk of his car. I mean, you're talking about a guy who worked his way up to major league at CBS, musical instruments, and then did save Fender and his heart and soul. And don't forget what Gibson was going through, at Norland. And
in 1986, the Norland Corporation, while in the middle of a hostile takeover, would sell off Gibson for about $12.5 million after sales would dip below $10 million the previous year. For the third time in its history, the Gibson Guitar Company has changed owners. On January 15, 1986, Henry Jeskowitz, David Berryman, and Gary Zabrowski purchased the entire Gibson operation. The first noticeable changes at Gibson have been the layoffs of numerous employees. For many, Gibson and Fender had fallen asleep at the wheel in terms of innovation and response to market demand, which is what had allowed companies like Dean, Hamer, and the like to not only enter the market, but thrive during the late 70s and early 80s. By offering a better version of a US-made guitar and catering to the serious musician, they were able to quickly establish themselves as premium brands.
This door had opened up that allowed Dean to step in, Charvel Jackson, Kramer, all of these brands that kicked into gear, and how they just grabbed, people's attention, BC Rich, all these things that came, Washburn, all these things came into play. And that's what I remember, being at this, music store that was traditionally a band and orchestra store, and they were kind of behind the times, behind the game of getting into the rock and roll world. And So there were already Fender dealers. There were already Gibson dealers. They wouldn't even talk to us, but the other ones would. So here I had this little store with with Washburn and BC Rich and Dean and Hohner. These instruments that no one heard of, no one had ever seen. We were the first Taylor dealer in Memphis, Tennessee.
However, by the mid-1980s, the gap that Fender and Gibson was leaving behind was filling up with numerous competing brands, most of them offering lower-priced imports. In 1985, with the Kramer Beretta and the Jackson Soloist dominating electric guitar sales, Dean would debut the Signature. This Stratocaster-style guitar would feature a chrome pickguard with a choice of either 3 single-coil or 2 humbucking pickups, fluorescent finishes with the Dean-O-Matic locking tremolo system, and would list at $399. This would be followed by another affordable Strat-style guitar, the Playmate. It would feature a rosewood fingerboard on a maple neck, 1 bridge humbucker and 2 single-coil pickups, standard tremolo, 5-position pickup selector, and a selection of high-gloss finishes, all at a list price of $294. With a new focus on producing guitars overseas at a lower price point, the need to sell in larger quantities would become essential. With that in mind, starting in 1986, Dean Guitars would begin doing business with Sears. Dean would later recall, "In the late 1980s, a buyer from Sears approached me because they wanted to upgrade and have a respected brand of guitars, like upgrading to a brand of jeans like Levi's."
And so we had to go to Jack. Jack was like, okay, I'll manufacture these for you. And that's what got us into Sears, because Court was selling Sears.
Dean Guitars would make their official debut in the Sears 1986 Fall-Winter catalog, where they would offer the Autograph, Hollywood V, Z, and Z bass models, along with the infamous Budweiser bow tie guitar. Quote, "This one's for you. Be the king of sounds for only $10 monthly when you play the same dynamic lead guitar seen nationwide on Budweiser commercials, humbucking pickup, single tone control, 22 fret fingerboard, $199. Dean Guitars would end up being sold in Sears catalogs through 1990. It was a polarizing move for the company, and in many ways, a move way ahead of its time.
But that's Dean, right? So he was always looking for a way, he was always looking for a path to sell more guitars.
I had gotten into Dean Guitars primarily, like a lot of people, because of Kerry Livgren. All of a sudden, this brand that I was really liking, it was never available for sale in Memphis to speak of. And all of a sudden, the Sears catalog had it. And so I was on a quest. I bought every one of them. I had just graduated college, and I went to work for a family-owned music store in Memphis that wanted to get into the combo game. That's what they called it back then. And, guitar, drums, and keyboards. The owners of the music store at that time told me, said, "We're not carrying Dean. They're in the Sears catalog. We can't compete with that."
There was some flack back from the dealers, but it was easy to overcome.
And so I think that there was a stigma when Dean did it. He was the first, and then among the first.
Quote, "Unfortunately, Zelinsky's reputation was built and subsequently destroyed on the mass market guitars. The minute every poser could get one, especially if he could get it at Sears, it became a very bad decision in terms of the guitar world."
If Mr. Sears walked into your music store today and said, "Would you put your guitar in my catalog, would you do it?" Because, sticking a Dean headstock in 750 million Sears catalogs that go out every year is not a bad thing for anybody, including you if you're selling them in your store.
I think it's just because the times. Dean was the first one to do that, and it worked. We had other products beside Bud. The Bud is what Sears wanted, and Jack, in his infinite wisdom, was like, "Well, you're going to take all this other stuff too."
Dean Guitars would continue down the affordable Super Strat route in 1987 with the Jammer listed at $439. This guitar offered 2 humbuckers, ebonol fingerboard, a Kaler-style locking tremolo system along with custom black hardware. In 1988, the Jammer would be offered with 2 single coils, 1 humbucking pickup, and a licensed Floyd Rose tremolo system at a price of $499. The Jammer would also spin off into 2 lower-priced alternatives. For the 1987 Sears Christmas catalog, the Jammer 2 would feature 1 humbucker, 2 single-coil pickups with the ebonol fingerboard and standard tremolo at a price of $189.99. In the 1989 Sears Christmas catalog, the Jammer 3, at a price of $219, would see the same humbucker single layout, but also a Floyd Rose-style locking tremolo system on certain models. There was even a Jammer bass offered in the 1989 Sears Christmas catalog, priced at $229.
I happened to live next to a Sears outlet store. And my dad, who was a music minister, we would go there every Tuesday because that's when the trucks came. All of a sudden, there was a whole stack of Dean Jammers. Black Dean Jammers. Jammer 3, Jammer 2, I can't remember which one. I bought them, and then it almost became a game after that point. And I will tell you that every single guitar that was in the catalog every year, I bought at least one from the outlet store.
Quote, volume was going up, profit margins were going down. It got to the point where we were selling a guitar for less than what we were making before in profit. Also in 1987, Dean would debut the mid-priced 88 Strat-style guitar to the lineup at a $599 list price, featuring a maple neck with ebonol fingerboard, Floyd Rose licensed locking tremolo, and a humbucker single layout with select by EMG pickups, all controlled by 3 individual switches. The Bel Air would be reintroduced during 1988, this time with custom black hardware, EMG active pickups, and a Kaler Floyd Rose tremolo system at a list price of $1199.
Yeah, it was Van Halen. It was Eddie that brought that whole shift into the Floyd Rose, right? So that was the whole era. And you know, we were getting guitars, and we were putting, trems, lock nut trems on some Dean guitars. Guys who had, purchased a Cadillac wanted that. So that, you had to route out in the back and get the cavities going. And guys were paying the money to do it just because they wanted, a locking nut whammy bar. And so that was that craze. And that was Eddie. That was all Eddie.
Dean would also begin to offer a small line of amplifiers starting in 1988, with the Master Blaster featuring a 20-watt 10-inch speaker and the Mini Blaster featuring a 10-watt 6-inch speaker. It's also worth mentioning the Firecrackle, debuting in the 1988 Sears Christmas catalog at a price of $269, and what seems to be an exclusive model available only at Sears during this time. Essentially a custom jammer with direct-mounted pickups, large block inlays, and a custom crackle paint finish. The 1988 model would feature a locking tremolo system and bound fingerboard, while the 89 and 90 models would have unbound fingerboards and standard tremolo systems. Quote, Dean's most visually arresting designs to date are found in the company's new line of custom airbrush guitars, which began shipping in February of 1989. The designs include a Freddy Krueger pizza face model, bare metal, featuring a bear shredding metal with blood dripping from its claws, the Flash Gordon-inspired Space Angels, and the appropriately titled Derriere, featuring a woman's bikini-clad bottom. Dean Guitars was struggling to compete against low-cost import guitars, and to make matters worse, the music industry as a whole experienced a decline in the late 80s. The industry would drop 3% in 1989, with another 2% in 1990.
1988. So there was a shift. So there was a shift at the store. My partner left, and so I was kind of left alone. And from that point on, I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't enjoying the retail experience anymore. And so I wound it down. It didn't go bankrupt. I wound it down. I paid everybody what I owed them. It was done.
We were importing guitars and we were still losing money. One day I woke up and realized that this is not the reason I got into the guitar business. It wasn't fun anymore.
And I had enough. And the import game was not agreeing with me, I think, at the time. And I decided to sell and get out.
at one point, Dean felt that he couldn't sustain Dean anymore to be competitive. So the first meeting we had, we went to Texas to meet with Rhythm Band. Are you familiar with that company, Rhythm Band? I think they originally bought Jackson. The guy was doing import stuff, and we met with him, and he loved Dean and what Dean was doing. So Dean and I meeting with the CEO of Rhythm Band, and he called Grover. And we talked to Grover because they put Grover up in business. And then at the very end, that's when Tropical came in. I think he just realized not to cash out, but, you know, he had his name. So if it was Dean Guitars was sold, he could still be Dean Zielinski. And if you look at, you can't compare the exact thing, but if you look at Leo Fender, it was Music Man, and it was George and Leo, you know, George Fullerton and Leo Fender. They could keep Fender couldn't have a Fender guitar, but he could be himself, who he was.
Quote, I then went into the custom furniture business, utilizing all of my woodworking skills. The difference here was, instead of designing a product once and producing it for years, I was designing a product every week and producing it only once. This actually helped to keep my design skills honed while away from the guitar business. Most of my time was occupied with designing and building high-end custom furniture for people all over Chicago. While Michael Jordan was winning championships, we were building his furniture.
I had about 8-9 years of that. I just said, and my love has always been guitars. But the market had to come back. I didn't, it really hit a nadir in the late 80s.
Dean really, he just had this sense, and he didn't want to be like everybody else. His whole persona was that we were us against the world.
There was an energy from around the mid 70s to around the mid to late 80s where the big hair bands and, the whole thing. Rock and roll at that time, and rock was like it was smoking. And if you had a music store at the time, or you were promoting or selling guitars, that was the era.
Dean would later recall in his 1995 interview, when I first got in the industry in 1976, I could build a quality guitar and fill a void in the market. I loved that aspect of it. Curly maple tops, binding, sunburst finishes, humbuckers, great necks. We made a high-quality Gibson-style stage guitar, like the vintage ones everyone wanted, but new. But in the late 80s, everything out there was bolt-on neck and made in Korea.
The Van Halen years, I guess, which, Van Halen was great for music and for the industry and certainly for the Floyd Rose. Everyone wanted a high-end fancy guitar. He shows up one day playing this thing built in a garage, painted with Testor's paint. He's the greatest guitar player people have seen since, Jimmy Page. And it's like, oh, you know what I mean? Everybody, it wasn't like everybody, it was fashionable to have a bolt-on cheap guitar.
Quote, not a single U.S. builder came through that period unscathed. Jackson, Charvel, B.C. Rich, and Hamer were sold. Kramer went out of business. Gibson got sold. Fender was in trouble and was recapitalized, and Dean was sold in 1991. In those days, you couldn't give away a U.S.-built guitar. It was an ugly period for guitars, and I didn't want any part of it.
I'm in this business because I can build guitars. So I think it got a little ugly for me when the import thing got hot and heavy.
All Dean ever wanted to do was make guitars, and that's what he's doing now, right? That's and he knows how to do it. I mean, he knows how to do it. He knows how to make a guitar.
But Dean just had this swagger. I don't know. He didn't have a ton of models, but the ones that he had were really, really cool. He was like a duck, he is across the water, but underneath the feet are going. So the mind was always going. He was always thinking of things. He was always thinking about how he was going to make his guitars better, how he was going to build them, ideas about advertising. He was sharp.
All my memories are positive, and it wasn't an easy time. I'm telling you, that's just part of the growth of what made all of us at that time. And because it's a cliche, the Wild West. At that time for guitar companies, it was the Wild West. But that 80s, that guitar world of these upstart companies was just a really exciting time.
In 1976, Dean Zielinski set out to build a better guitar and did just that. he developed a line of guitars that, while inspired by Gibson's past, were truly unique in their approach and design. The ML stands as a lasting tribute to a childhood friend and has become the flagship of the Dean Guitars brand. The Cadillac is an example of a truly top-of-the-line instrument with aesthetics and features to cater to the most demanding guitarists when it debuted in 1979. The V and Z models gave customers a premium alternative to the Flying V and Explorer while also making a statement with that big V headstock. For Zielinski, he was part of a new generation of builders in the late 1970s who decided to put quality back into American guitars. There really was no roadmap on how to be successful with this strategy, but Zielinski was able to effectively find his customers and grow the business despite his young age, the economic recession of the early 80s, and multiple setbacks within his own company. The fact that Zielinski was able to do all of this by his early 30s is truly an amazing accomplishment, and the fact that his designs are still in production today prove his lasting impact almost 50 years later.
A lot of times I would be working with Dean's bird, Alvin, on my shoulder, because for whatever reason in the world, that bird liked me and would come down the hall, climb up on my desk using the handles on the drawers, and then sit there, get on this side on my shoulder, sit on my shoulder on this, while I have the phone in this side, and it would go, and people would say, what? People on the other end say, what's that? Don't worry about it. It's a little trouble on the line.